Our Pacific Island region, scattered across 30 million square kilometers of ocean, or 1/3 of the Earth's surface, is dealing with both the climate crisis as well as difficult and diverse set of law enforcement, governance, and security challenges. Across our Blue Pacific, women peace builders are contributing to innovative peace, development, and humanitarian nexus approaches, the triple nexus approach, to respond to the most critical human security priorities facing the Pacific. In 2020, as COVID-19 and Tropical Cyclone Harold challenged the joint capacity of the Pacific region, we've mobilized to support prevention, awareness raising, preparedness, and protection. These challenges did not come as a surprise to us. In 2015, through GPAC Pacific, we worked to integrate language on climate change in the global study on UNSCR 1325 and supported the innovative, at that time, language of UNSCR 2242 on the impacts of climate change and the global nature of health pandemics on the trajectory of conflict. Now, as expressed in the consultation for the 2020 Peacebuilding Architecture Review on Gender, Climate, and Peace in the Pacific, a key priority for women first responders, faith communities, and peace builders is to connect all parts of the triple nexus, and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is a strong anchor. This is evident through human security assessments, food security programs, community dialogue, the use of innovative information and communication platforms in mainstream media, as well as the provision of emergency grants tackling the vulnerabilities of out-of-work women and girls.
Pacific feminist peacebuilding has its roots in the 1960s and 70s. Since the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific campaign in the 1980s, women have led collaborative advocacy campaigns on peace and security, including responses to armed conflict, political crises, and gun violence in Bougainville, Fiji, and Solomon Islands in the late 1980s to early 2000s, and pro-democracy riots in Tonga in 2006. Since the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action, we have seen a greater call for the prevention of armed conflict towards achieving peace and security, putting women's participation as central to conflict prevention and resolution efforts. Our paper builds on women's activism in the Pacific, working across a geographically diverse region and tackling barriers to participate in political institutions and implement national and regional WPS mechanisms. A localization approach has seen peace activists working with indigenous and faith leaders not only out of respect to traditional structures, but also out of necessity. In a region where poor transportation and communication infrastructure is a daily reality, local women actors are mobilizing in innovative and creative ways, particularly in conflict prevention, recovery, and humanitarian response efforts. Yet, despite such demonstrated ability to participate in the peace and security field, regional mechanisms in the Pacific have not adapted to incorporate women's leadership and skills. So our paper brings attention to women's agency and capacity to participate and engage in political institutions across the Pacific, and how Pacific peacebuilding networks are working through traditional and customary systems, as well as engaging with faith leaders to prevent the resurgence of armed conflict. We also bring attention to how women human rights defenders use peacebuilding approaches in addressing gun control issues and contributing towards ending the proliferation of small arms in the Pacific. And we bring attention to how feminist approaches to addressing climate change and women's role in relief and recovery can bridge the existing gap in women's leadership roles within mechanisms focused on responding to climate change. Our paper makes the case that greater recognition and support is needed of the efforts and role of community-based women's movements. By looking at the rich and complex her story of women's activism in the Pacific, can we find important clues to addressing the challenges women peace activists continue to face in localizing regional and national WPS mechanisms. Peacebuilding in the Pacific region requires balancing traditional and customary practice with modern governance, including accountability to the culture of human rights, by engaging with indigenous leaders and church leaders, as well as creating a sustainable space for peace education. Peacebuilding dialogue and mediation that challenge and transform patriarchal practices to enable women and youth of all diversities to access decision-making spaces. At the same time, the importance of coalition building and collaboration for transformational change has seen Pacific women peacebuilders engage through the GPAC Pacific Network and contribute to the establishment of the Shifting the Power Coalition, forged by 13 diverse Pacific women and women's organizations from Fiji, PNG including Bougainville, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu, Australia, and the Pacific Disability Forum. Since the formation of the coalition, Pacific Forum leaders have adopted the Boe Declaration. This expanded notion of peace and security is a welcome development in line with the Pacific Regional Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security.
Pacific women are waging peace to allow effective response to the complex and multifaceted threats and challenges to our human security, which require partnerships that support local women's considerable initiative and capacity. Women aren't just passive victims of violence and inequality, but also provide security during conflict. This is the essence of UNSCR 1325. However, the global study on the implementation of 1325 identified that while resources have gone into formulating state-centric national action plans and increasing women empowerment and military, women's needs at the local level have largely gone unmet. The 20th anniversary of 1325 reminds us that resourcing participation in conflict prevention, the protection of women's human rights defenders, the integration of the WPS agenda and relief and recovery and humanitarian response, such as for COVID-19, is more than just about service delivery programs. We must tackle the drivers of conflict, as well as the prevention of the resurgence of violence. Dedicated resources must be allocated to national and local women's rights actors to strengthen agency, amplify voice, and build on collaborative opportunities, including women-led coalitions and feminist practices, to enable a shift from funding crisis reaction measures to gender-responsive peace-building and preventative action. In the context of the Generation Equality Forum, WPS Humanitarian Action Compact, we have an opportunity to resource women at the forefront of peace, security, and humanitarian efforts, to promote and protect women's human rights and the work of women peace builders and women's human rights defenders, as well as ensure women's leadership in all peace and humanitarian decision-making processes. The way forward is a critical opportunity to strengthen the inclusion of young women peace builders and young women affected by crises in peace, security, and humanitarian processes and efforts, including in the context of the implementation of the WPS agenda. For our Pacific region, it's time to carry out and realize commitments on WPS and humanitarian action. It's time for a regional peace-building architecture that brings all stakeholders together to the table, to share analysis, enabling policy and program coherence and complementarities. We need to redesign the table and shift the power to those who have the biggest stakes in sustaining peace in the region: women, young people, faith leaders, and local community.